Elections are complicated. They always have been, and they always will be. For as long as they are free and fair, it is a certainty that there will be logistical hurdles to overcome. In fact, it's the elections where everything runs suspiciously smoothly and preferred candidates waltz into office with 99.9% of the vote that should be a greater concern than the always messy issue of participatory democracy. But though a degree of complexity should be desired, it isn't a convoluted process that makes an election legitimately reflective of the popular will. For if that were the case, the elections of the Roman Republic would be the gold standard, when in reality, as we detailed earlier, they were a vehicle for the aristocracy to channel public opinion into a narrow band of acceptable outlets, and even there, the actual votes of the everyday Romans were outweighed by a small cadre of elites. For the republican model that Rome adopted after the overthrow of the Tarquins was constructed in opposition to the radical democracy of Athens, and was intended to preserve the dominance of the aristocrats who had led the revolution, and to balance the opinions of the broader populace against the sentiments of the oligarchs who held power and desperately wanted to keep it. In addition to formal legal processes that watered down the vote of the poor urban plebeians so that it counted for a minuscule fraction of that of a senator, there were also societal and cultural pressures aimed squarely at the poor to ensure that they voted in line with proper expectations. For until 139, votes were expressed orally, meaning that each man's ballot preferences were publicly known. It should not be difficult to understand how dramatically this would have affected elections. Cicero bemoaned the introduction of the secret ballot by stating, "The people should not have been provided with a hiding place, where they could conceal a mischievous vote by means of the ballot, and keep the good in ignorance of their real opinions." Though it certainly irked the aristocratic sensibilities of Cicero, there is a reason that a secret ballot is viewed as integral to the modern democratic process, for fear of reprisal can have a profound effect on an individual's willingness to contradict the interests of the powerful and alter the status quo. This only becomes more pronounced as the individual's social position becomes more precarious. So the secret ballot is always needed, but it was particularly necessary in the Roman Republic, as the intricate web of social favors and obligations placed the underclass firmly within the influence and often the debt of the powerful. The unique and all-encompassing system of patronage that dominated all aspects of Roman society made the popular struggle for the secret ballot all the more pressing, and it was achieved over 4 successive legislative reforms. First for the election of magistrates in 139, then for most jury trials in 137, before being extended to the passage of legislation in 131, and finally to all trials in 107. The effect that this succession of laws would have on the Republic was profound, and though the secret ballot drastically increased the ability of the average Roman citizen to express himself through elections, the reforms also introduced unprecedented chaos into the political process and heralded the dramatic increase of bribery as a campaign tactic, playing no small part in the steady delegitimization of the republican order and the eventual rise of the imperial system. But before turning to the ballot reforms and their effects, further commentary is needed on why they were so necessary. As mentioned above, the tendrils of the patronage system touched all facets of life in Rome, and few but the most impoverished urban citizens could be said to be totally free of the obligations it entailed. For though a plebeian shopkeeper could not expect a relationship with a prominent senator, he may be a member of a collegia or similar association that counted an equestrian businessman as a patron, who was in turn the client of a middling senator, that then counted one of the chief aristocratic families as his own benefactor. Generals could also number former soldiers among their clients. Entire rural communities could be counted as clients of wealthy landowners, and freed slaves retained clientship obligations to their former masters, which would be passed to their own descendants. In campaigns for high office, elite patricians could trade money or favors to win one another's support, and line up clientship networks as powerful political blocs that could be used to secure election. While the ballots were public, men at each stage in the chain could be counted on to publicly back the candidate that their patron had aligned with. This was an effective way to assemble a political coalition, because the multi-tiered patron-client relationship was not just legally codified. There were social norms of reciprocity that governed how patrons and clients were expected to interact. One of the gravest sins that a client could commit was to spurn his patron and demonstrate ingratitude. Such an affront risked severing the bonds of patronage and all of the protections that it offered to those within the system. It would also mark a man as untrustworthy, and he would have immense difficulty securing a new patron. For many at the lower rung of society, the gifts of money and food from their patrons were likely the difference between modest prosperity and starvation. We can understand, then, why these social relationships endured for so long and proved so effective at preventing robust class solidarity from emerging among the lower order. The tight social controls on voting behavior also explains why outright examples of coercion are rare. We only have 2 such instances in our sources, because spoken threats were unnecessary when implied threats were so effective. But if public voting was by its very nature a tool of oligarchic discipline and control, as Cicero says it was, then how was the popular party ever able to pass the legislation in 139 that made voting for magistrates secret? The answer lies in the dynamic shifts that were manifesting in Roman society as its equestrian business class became wealthier and hence more influential in the generations after the Second Punic War, as the entire Mediterranean came under Roman domination. The merchant class had finally accrued the power and influence necessary to assert itself, for though the secret ballot was a popular reform, we must not assume that it was a victory of the poor plebeians alone. The urban poor were accorded so little influence in the Roman system that even if they all rallied behind the same cause, no action would be taken unless a large portion of the elite aligned with them. Furthermore, it is no accident that the law was passed in 139, for this fundamental split between the upper class of Rome is what allowed the popular faction to flex its muscle, a trend that led to the previously mentioned ballot reforms of 137 and 131, and culminated in the election of Tiberius Gracchus as tribune in 131. The success of his political movement would provoke the optimate reaction that led to violence being utilized to shatter the popular cause for nearly a decade. But even after the patrician death squads had vanquished Tiberius Gracchus, and then later the movement of his brother Gaius, no effort was made to overturn the secret ballot. Perhaps this was because the initial pieces of legislation had proved less effective at ensuring the secrecy of the ballot than originally hoped. The laws may have only guaranteed a secret ballot in theory, but not in practice. For in 119, the popular hero Gaius Marius offered a proposal that seems strange to us. His law sought to narrow the passage through which voters could walk on their way to cast their ballot, so that they could only enter single file, one at a time, instead of en masse. This modest proposition hardly seems like something that should be recalled as landmark legislation, but its importance is indicated by the strong aristocratic reaction against the proposal. While serving as tribune, he introduced a law concerning the mode of voting, which, as it was thought, would lessen the power of the nobles in judicial cases, whereupon Cotta, the consul, opposed him and persuaded the Senate to contest the law, and to summon Marius before it to explain his procedure. The Senate voted to do this, and Marius appeared before it. He did not, however, behave like a young man who had just entered political life without any brilliant services behind him, but assumed at once the assurance which his subsequent achievements gave him, and threatened to haul Cotta off to prison unless he had the vote rescinded. Cotta then turned to Metellus and asked him to express his opinion, and Metellus, rising in his place, concurred with the consul. But Marius called in the officer and ordered him to conduct Metellus himself to prison. Metellus appealed to the other tribunes, but none of them came to his support. So the Senate gave way and rescinded its vote. Marius therefore came forth in triumph to the people and got them to ratify his law. Marius finally secured the true secrecy of the vote. The reform helps remind us that rights on paper are worthless, unless backed by the logistical and institutional frameworks that make them practically enforceable and universally applicable. After all, African Americans had the constitutional right to vote in the Jim Crow South, but not the practical right. Theory and practice can diverge greatly, and popular campaigners cannot rest on legal recognition for their victories alone if they are not accompanied by enforcement mechanisms. Given how vigorously the conservative faction opposed the introduction of the secret ballot, one may be surprised to learn that once it became an accepted element of Roman elections, there was not a political sea change that brought populares to a dominant position in the state. In fact, things seem to have changed very little on the political scene, in no small part because running for office was so expensive that only the upper echelons of Roman society could even mount a campaign, much less distribute the largesse that was required to ensure victory. Though the Roman populace was now more free than ever to voice its political opinions, choices were still limited. We must remember that the outside elements of the elite which had been instrumental in securing the passage of these laws were still exponentially wealthier than the average Roman. Never mind the urban poor. As such, once the benefits of high office were more accessible, they naturally fell in with their class allies in the old aristocracy. If you're enjoying this video, please do us a favor by liking, commenting, and subscribing. We're a small channel, and this is the only way to get the almighty YouTube algorithm to notice us. Furthermore, you can help Tribunate become more sustainable by becoming a member for as little as 99 cents a month. Thank you for all of your support. During the early days of the secret ballot, even when popular-leaning candidates like Marius or his ally Saturninus won office, no comprehensive, systematic changes were ever introduced that would fundamentally alter the political economy of Rome or its hierarchical social structure. We must here reiterate that the push for a secret ballot had never been about a universal vision of equitable human rights, but about the brute realities of politics and leveling the playing field between the old senatorial families and a newer generation of upstarts. Because the ballot reforms weren't intended to bring about a popular revolution, we should not be surprised that a seismic shift in Roman politics never materialized. In fact, the most pronounced impact of the ballot reform law was that electoral bribery now increased exponentially. This was perhaps an unintended side effect of the law, as evidence indicates that the initial reforms were designed to decrease the appeal of bribing voters, because a candidate could have no guarantee of their eventual support. A fine theory, but what actually ended up happening was that candidates increasingly felt they could no longer rely on the bonds of patronage and clientship to secure votes, so leaned all in on flattering the masses through lavish campaigns, promises of future favors, and naturally, outright bribery on a scale that dwarfed previous spending. With the entire Mediterranean world under its influence, Rome was becoming wealthier and wealthier with each passing day, and as detailed in an earlier video, the prospect of securing a highly lucrative provincial governorship through election to high office was so enticing that campaigns became so expensive that even those from the inner core of elite families had to secure outside financing for their electoral ambitions. The desperation of the candidates then resulted in a radical inversion of social relations during a campaign. Men from the best families, who had always turned up their noses at the typical Roman, were now debasing themselves for the support of the masses. striking up conversations with poor farmers and putting on a smile as they pretended to care about the causes dear to them. But charm only goes so far, and candidates would openly bid for the support of citizens through outright vote buying. Because the citizen was now under no compulsion to actually vote for the candidate he had accepted gifts from, candidates sought to outdo their rivals and make the voters so grateful through massive gifts that they would be sure to follow through on their promises of support. Roman voters are often derided for participating in this scheme, but in my view it was completely rational and even fully defensible given the circumstances. Few, if any, candidates were willing to offer tangible material change to the Roman economy. So why not sell your vote to the man who offered the most in return? It was a bleak situation, of course, because even though the gifts a man could receive for selling his vote were significant, they were naturally less than the share of the broader Roman surplus to which he ought to have been entitled as a citizen. It speaks to the incredible exploitation of the provinces by the Roman governors that they could take on massive debts to fund campaigns, but return from their year abroad with enough to pay off their creditors and still become incredibly wealthy themselves. It was the limited ideological scope of Roman politics which made such bribery necessary, and that also made the eventual collapse of the system inevitable. For as Roman dominions grew, the constitutional system designed for the government of a city-state failed to adapt. Exceptions to the prohibitions on placing too much power in the hands of a single man were made, and then, decade after decade, these exceptions became the rule, and republican government found itself at the mercy of warlords that had risen through the constitutional order but now held power that transcended it. Rome was increasingly being asked to choose between its traditional system of elections and shared power that their ancestors had mapped out, or the elevation of strongmen capable of governing the far-reaching territories that had injected so much wealth and luxury into the Republic. Eventually, the people and the aristocrats alike would opt for the stability of a monarch who could oversee the plunder of the Mediterranean while guaranteeing peace at home, even if this meant the steady erasure of their political rights. Of course, the choice between empire and republic was never actually on the ballot in a single election, but it was a choice made over the course of a century, as new precedents were set, and each generation decided that a few small compromises were necessary to preserve the wealth offered by the empire. As in all republics, the choice to remain free was constantly before the citizens, whether or not they knew it. Augustus would of course maintain a republican facade throughout his reign, as he was unwilling to fully declare the extent of his power and risk the fate of his adoptive father Caesar. Because the forms of the republic persisted, elections still took place under Augustus, but these were no longer the messy, bitter affairs of a free and open society, but the neat and orderly bestowal of offices and honors upon preferred candidates. The elections were safe and straightforward, because they were now meaningless. They had been the sacrifice in a final act of bribery, Augustus's tempting offer of security and prosperity for the seemingly small price of political liberty.